Now, a pleasure to introduce Michelle Fletcher, who's Research Associate on the Visual Commentary on Scripture at King's College London, where she's also a Research Fellow. She's also author of Rereading Revelation as Pastiche, Imitating the Past, which is published by Bloomsbury in 2017. Michelle, I'm intrigued. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So, what's about to follow is going to be a slightly more lowbrow pop culture version of the paper we had the pleasure to listen to before lunch. So I'm going to be breaking things down and bringing us off of perhaps such a high plane of beautiful Blake art. But I've called this Visualizing the Apocalypse as a thing of the past. And this is what we're going to be thinking about. So the future can be a terrifying prospect. The apocalypse is often thought of as the future. The unknown is the apocalypse coming. The book of Revelation, known as the Apocalypse, the first word spawned the notion of apocalypse, is often seen as a blueprint for the future, a way that humans are wrestling with the unknown, conflated with the time periods that are seen in Daniel. We see notions of what might happen. Search the internet, have a quick Google, come here. People have done this from the book's inception. How do we control the terrifying unknown, the black space that is the future? But I want to mess up our temporal agenda a little bit in this conference. The apocalypse sits there in the future. But when we're projecting into the future, what concepts do we take with us? Kazimir Malevich, when he created the black square, said that this was our zero. He adds the 0.10 to his 1915 exhibition to say that he has created a point, as if silence in heaven in some ways. From here, we will go on. The old is past, the new is coming, year dot, a black square. But as time has gone on, he made 4 versions of this. His original one that was hung in the place of the icon in the exhibition, in the Tretyakov, which never travels, has seen the paint crack. In 2015, they did x-rays before their exhibition there, and we have found that underneath what seems to be a blank black canvas, actually other colourful work exists. And perhaps underneath that, another image as well. Hidden graffiti as well in the grey-white around the edge, perhaps alluding to a French artwork which they didn't know he might have had knowledge of. It looks like he's a first, and he claimed he was, but actually he's caught up in an inheritance. He's caught up in a past, and underneath what seems like a blank canvas, the past begins to crack through. And so I want to take us into the depths of something far more terrifying than the future, which we feel we can't escape, which is our past, which we definitely cannot escape. And the book of Revelation is a place to get to know your past. So what I'm going to do is use artworks, ones that are seemingly lowbrow, to get us to start to think about this relationship between past and present and turn ourselves away from the future apocalypse and into wrestling with notions of now and the fear of what has been and follow us around. So we've got the black square hovering in the presentation for the whole time, okay, so it's there. Revelation is imbued with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible, as I will say. Here is a list of scholars who have wrestled with this issue. Of all the New Testament books, it has the most allusions to Hebrew Bible texts, somewhere between 200 to 700, depending on who's counting. The fabric is a veritable replay of the past. What do we do with this and how do we read it? Well, the past is terrifying for scholars because we want to control texts. And here Gregory Beale shows us the issue. Many, indeed most, Old Testament reminiscences are combined together into groups. Sometimes 4, 5 or more Old Testament references are merged into one picture. How are such combined allusions to be studied? How indeed, these questions, my name down the end, haunts me at night. How do we read these things? Tragic little life that I have. Well, the past can be seen to control us. We're always told you can't get away from your roots. So we reverse this in biblical studies. We go back, we find the origins, and we say, let's find the controlling Hebrew Bible text that will make sense of Revelation's seemingly spiraling material. So, for the Whore of Babylon, obviously inspired by Jeremiah 51, or for the Son of Man, dominated by a Danielic influence. Notice power rhetorics in this. Read Ezekiel if you want to understand what's going on here. Yeah, that's going to help, really easy. But you can see the idea. Find something else which is being alluded to, brought into the text, and it can help you make sense of the image that you are facing. And biblical scholars' relationship in Revelation with the past tends to have this idea that it can control, or that it's a continuity. So God did in the past, so God did now. So people were important in the past, Ezekiel had visions of God, so I, Revelation author, have authority too by using similar parlance. I've got credibility as a result if I can say I'm part of a tradition, and it can control what we're looking at. And as I've said, this leads to a huge amount, so much ink, of allusion spotting and Hebrew Bible source hunting. So where I sit in that line is slightly different. I wanted to play with the past because that's what Revelation's doing. Revelation never once quotes a Hebrew Bible text. So this is not a case of take it, put it somewhere and maintain its roots. It combines, imitates and confuses. And so to read this past imbued text, I wanted to move into a world of past play. And my methodology involved turning to Post-Modernism, because we all love Post-Modernism. No, I love Post-Modernism. And into the world where a fear of being alive with your past, and where the sense of authenticity that we have, the need for the new, the need for the original, or the need for maintaining a tradition becomes broken and played with. I specifically dealt with Pastiche, but just treat that lightly for this presentation, and if you want to probe me more afterwards, do. But we move into a world of copy, variation, pastiche, parody, replay, sequel, all of these notions. Well, the past is being played with and muddied. So, your first past case study to get you warmed up. Revelation 1, a multivalent past. In Revelation 1, after the initial announcement, there is an apocalypse and introduction of the author as John and who he's going to be writing to, these 7 churches which will receive messages in Revelation 2 and 3. In the middle of this is a Christophany or a theophany or a Jesus-ophany. We have a revelation of a figure described as one like a son of man, which resonates with Daniel, not the son of man. This is slightly different from synoptic traditions, although might be absorbing them. And let's face it, it's a bit weird. Lego Bible, my favourite, is doing quite a good job. How do we actually see what's going on here? There is a man with a 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth. He looks a bit like a human. He's got fiery eyes, bronze feet. He's holding 7 stars in his hand, not getting burnt by them. He's also got the keys to death and Hades. He's got a gold sash. Here it's around his waist. They're actually around his boobies, his man boobies. It's quite high. He's wearing linen down to the ground. He's a complicated figure. We can see Jura wrestling with him as well. What do we do with this? How do we understand it? Well, my scholarly predecessors have surprisingly tried to control it by finding a precedent for the image. Is it a priestly image, perhaps? Long garments, priest robes in Exodus? Or is it more like an angel? In Daniel, there are 2 texts which particularly seem to mix with this image in Revelation 1, and they seem to have angel characteristics. But he's also got lovely white hair like wool, which draws on Daniel 7, where the Ancient of Days is described as having hair white as wool. This is a problem for us Revelation scholars. Is he a priest or an angel or a divine? What is he? And is it drawing on Daniel 7 or is it drawing on the angel in Daniel 10? It's important, right? Is it an angel, divine? What are we going on here? Let's just relax a bit and go into the world of postmodern art. So these are your imitative case studies to start off with, thinking in a little bit of a different way. Beyond Norgard's Christian III monument. Norgard dialogues with Danish history in this work. It's highly, highly eclectic. Can you vaguely see the image there? He's a great artist if you're not familiar with him. He chops up bits of horses and puts them into pots. What's not to love? But here he is combining together lots of different elements, and none of them have a clear controlling force. We have a statue of the dying slave on the top, stood on a big rock, which is on a tomb, which has a square in the middle, which has an egg and a fly in it. He is drawing on many different parts of Danish culture, as I said. He's imitating Christian Floris's tomb, which is in Roskilde Cathedral, for Christian, who was a Danish king. He's bringing in Danish elements of breakfast in the egg in the centre. At the same time, the big stone at the top is remarkably like the stone that the Little Mermaid sits on, one of Copenhagen's most famous artworks. The dying slave is filled with pegs. Is this Michelangelo, or could it be alluding to Bertel Tolvardsen, who is Denmark's most famous export, who actually went to Italy to become famous and then came back? So really, he's an Italian, he's Danish, exporting Italy. What I'm trying to say with this artwork is that you can see that not one part controls it, but each of them work together to give us a construction of Danish nationality. There are anxieties here about what is it, what is the cultural history of Denmark, and each of these are brought together into one. Umberto Eco's Name of the Road is another great example. We have William Baskerville. We know it's kind of a detective story, ultimately unfulfilling. Hound of the Baskervilles, he's a bit like Sherlock Holmes, but he's also like William Ockham. He also quotes Aquinas. We also see him like other famous Franciscans. As a character, William is not one thing or another, but an amalgamation of these different time points, different characters to create somebody who is uniquely him. To deconstruct him and say, well, he's most like Sherlock Holmes, is to unsee the point of the text, which is Eco is building up a complicated composite image alive with different moments in the past. What on earth is Michelle talking about in relation to Revelation? Let's have a go. What if we do not read Revelation 1 looking for a controlling text or a controlling image, but that we start to see this theophany, Christophany, as an unveiling of many elements, all of which work together with equal potency? He's a priest, angel, Messiah, divine, ruler. The reference to the mastois is actually only occurs in Song of Songs, in the Septuagint version, in the Greek version. And later on in Revelation, a bride appears. So actually, to pick up a subtle reference to a lover is bang on. It looks like Daniel 7. It sounds like Daniel 10. It sounds like Ezekiel 1. It sounds like Ezekiel 9. Introduced you to Ezekiel 9 if you weren't familiar with it earlier on, with the angels going around marking people on the forehead. Well, later on, guess what? There are destroyer angels in Revelation. It looks like Exodus. Exodus is all in Revelation. And the synoptic traditions are there too. He also looks a bit like Hecate, Greco-Roman goddess who had the keys to death and Hades, and also a bit like the emperor with the 7 stars. There's a coin, Domitian mint, where he holds 7 stars in his hand you might be familiar with. What if we read this image, therefore, as an amalgamation of past images, brought together and held in equal weight and tension, where we read them in their complexity, and we allow the weight of these past images mixing together to give a potent Christ figure? That's our first example. think with a multivocal past in Revelation? How can you have a text that's made up of so many other textual elements if you're not allowing them to speak to each other, if you're trying to separate them apart? How can we separate up our past? I can't separate out my past bits of me. So maybe we need to think of Revelation this way. Okay, Revelation 17, an effective past. Revelation 17 is the whore of Babylon. Then one of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So he carried me away in the spirit to the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed with purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, Mystery, Babylon the Great, Mother of Whores and the Earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. But the angel said to me, "Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. And the 10 horns that you saw, and the beast will hate the whore, they will make her desolate and naked, they will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire." Perfect after dinner text. This text haunts our hot scholarly pasts. We have anxiety with this in the academy. Just look, if you do a Google image, all the different things that you can see the whore of Babylon has come to represent. Sarah Palin is my personal favourite, but it becomes far more problematic. It's very difficult to see with the light, but in the top right, there is, left, sorry, dyslexic. There's a naked woman with spines going through her body. We've got America, the whore, the Pope, the Virgin Mary, highly sexualized images. We've got some of the woodcuts towards the church. And very, very problematic, this is the one that particularly haunts us from the past readings in Revelation scholarship, is the reading, I've got that picture underneath the whore America, of the Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem as being the whore of Babylon. So they killed Jesus, so they get destroyed. Terrible anti-Semitic readings that have gone on in the past, which we have the inheritance of as modern biblical scholars. What do we do with this? How do we read this image? And who is she? Well, a recourse to the past has happened. Let's get back to the Greco-Roman world. Let's get back from the effective ideas. And most of all, try and argue as much as possible that this is not Jerusalem. There are a couple of people who still do argue that there are similarities to Hebrew Bible texts which relate to the destruction of Jerusalem, specifically Ezekiel 16 and 23, known as the texts of terror. They are brutal parts of the Hebrew Bible where Israel, Jerusalem are seen as the adulterous wife. Similarities to Jeremiah 4 as well. Margaret Barker, Josephine Ford have argued for these points. But most of all, as Christopher said early on today, Roma is seen to be the major idea. And David Aune has done an argument that perhaps the image could be dealing with this coin, which you really can't see, which has Roma sat with a sword on her knee, sat on 7 hills. So the idea that perhaps this is taking this imagery and mocking it and saying, you think you're a proud winner, you're actually a whore with a cup full of blood. Pierre Prigent argues that this is reviving ideas of Babylon, directly Babylon. The name Babylon obviously is indicative, but it was used for Rome at this point historically. He's arguing that actually this is dealing with Jeremiah 51, taking a past text there. Barbara Rossing argues that actually this is a trope of evil choice from Proverbs 1-9, where you choose good lady, nice linen, nasty lady, pretty cloths, and a road to destruction. This is what she's arguing they meant to choose: nasty city, nice city. And then there's an idea Gregory Beale has, which is this is an eschatological city, which in the Hebrew Bible, the text also looks remarkably like Isaiah 23, and Nineveh, also seen in Nahum. Now, what I wanted to kind of convey to you here is that this text, I'm just reading it out to you in English, but actually it's taking on all of these different Hebrew Bible texts. You can hear them in it. Each of these people make erudite arguments which seem vaguely convincing, although the Jerusalem Israel is seen to be the least convincing. But they all agree that it's full of Hebrew Bible resonances. It doesn't exactly map. So, for example, if you say, well, it's Babylon or Jerusalem, the idea is before, if the audience were Jerusalem, they were having the punishment poured down on their heads, whereas here, they're watching it happen to someone else. So you cannot map this exactly. There's a difference. They also argue that it's an exaggerated, relocated trope full of familiar imagery. A woman, adultery, idolatry. We know these things, they've been around. And they all want to control its effective properties. They all want to say this text needs to be held down by controlling text so that we don't get carried away and we don't get caught up in anything effective. So what part does the past really have to play here, and how do we relate to it? Sergio Leone, he'll give us the answer. Sergio Leone was a man very much in touch with the past of the genre of westerns. His films, his Dollars trilogy, as we know, or you don't know, Italian westerns, which put Clint Eastwood into the limelight, is dealing with the legacy of the West. But his major masterpiece, in my opinion, is Once Upon a Time in the West. Now, this was originally, when it came out in Italian, actually called There Once Was a West. And it's a film about a loss of what the West was. He is aware that you can never get back to the Western as it was. He wants to film in the footsteps of John Ford. This film famously has Monument Valley in it. He sold out so he could go to America to do this, in some ways. And it is a text that is alive with the past of westerns. It's a text about, a western about westerns. Christopher Frayling, Western expert, a kaleidoscopic view of all American westerns put together. Sergio is looking to the past of the West and bringing them together. Once Upon a Time in the West is more about other Western movies than it is about the West itself, says Edward Buscombe. Sergio himself: I wanted to take all the most stereotypical characters from the American West on loan. I wanted to present a homage to the Western at the same time as showing the mutations which American society was undergoing at the time. So he's with one hand looking to the past, but realizing that the past is being placed in a new way and that this is going to allow him to come into dialogue with the present. So I'm going to take you through a scene to talk you through how we might deal with the past replayed in new locations and how it may affect us. The reason that I use these different texts, by the way, is to allow us to play, to allow us to open up our minds, to be affected, to remember what it's like to experience a text that moves us emotionally, because we're so used, well, my guild is so used to over-intellectualizing biblical texts and trying to control it. Okay, so the scene that I'm going to use is officially known as the McBain Massacre. In the top, can you see this with the sun shining on it? Ace. In the top is Brett McBain. Let's see. Brett McBain is looking around and he hears everything go quiet, which evokes the Searchers, which famously has this homestead family making a home. At the beginning, silence comes down. What's going to happen? Something ominous. There's a party going on. We find it's a wedding feast. They're going to celebrate, evoking the dances perhaps in Shane, or the famous dancing scene from My Darling Clementine with Henry Fonda. But then things go dark, a gunshot happens and terror comes about, reminding us again, perhaps with the Searchers, where Debbie is left waiting and terrified. Timmy, the youngest ginger-haired child, comes running out as he hears things happening, and there's a famous shot as he comes out with the door. He goes from dark into light, and the Searchers plays with this motif. John Ford's Searchers' previous text, obviously, this light, dark motif at the end. John Wayne is left outside. Timmy comes out in a faster version of this, and he is greeted, left holding a bottle of soda pop, which is famous in Shane for him getting into a bar brawl, facing a group of men. This evokes Joey from Shane, the very, very annoying child in that film. Oh, Shane, Mother wants you. But it's a bit different because this guy's got ginger hair. So we're realising this is not Joey, it's something different. As the men come forward, they're wearing long duster coats. The music comes to a crescendo and we hear an electric guitar starting to blast out. Something's a bit different. The duster coats are in My Darling Clementine. They're also in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance at the beginning. And they sweep past this stump. And the stump is famous in Shane for bringing together the men. They have this really masculine chopping session where they learn their bro love. But it's swept away. And Timmy is left on his own, sorry, just so you can see Timmy, with 5 men walking towards him in a very beautiful line. And it's Sergio Leone at his most operatic Western. Tiny Timmy, 5 men. This reminds us of this famous showdown. The man on his own, like in Darling Clementine and obviously famously in High Noon. What happens here at the end, sorry I've just jumped on a little bit quickly, is the leader, he's called Frank, he says, Frank, now you've called me by name, and he shoots us, Timmy, as we're looking down the barrel of the gun. What happens when we're experiencing this text, which is alive with past Westerns, with past Western experiences? Well, in some ways, it heightens the distance because what we're seeing is a very different idea of what we've seen before. There's no Shane to come and save Joey. There's no John Wayne to go off and get Debbie back. This is Timmy and 5 men, and our viewpoint is changed. We're not looking on from the sidelines as we have in the past, where we have experienced a heightened sense of excitement. Good versus bad, man on man, 1 versus 3, 1 versus 2, who's going to win? This is a man with a gun and an unarmed child with a bottle of soda pop to defend himself. That's it. And in that sense, perhaps we question our own involvement in the violence of the Western, in this masculine stereotype of the shootout, because we realise this is different. We're given a new viewpoint. It's a classic trope of masculinity, but Sergio confuses this in his portrayal of the shootout. This isn't how it's meant to play out, right? It doesn't end up with 5 men and a child. And what happens as we experience this is all of our past Western experiences are brought together. The positiveness of the stump, the negativity of the dusters, the positivity of the excitement, the fear, it's all hyped together. And so we have a shootout, as I said, where we're looking down the gun, where we relive our own experience. It's highly effective, but in a way that allows us to think about it. It's a reawakening of the past. It's a reawakening, if you're a Western fan, as you can see I am, it allows you to move with a reawakening of what you've seen before. All of these past texts are combined together into a classic trope. You have multiple experiences at once of good things and bad things. The alterations in the text, Joey is not Timmy, blonde hair, auburn hair, it changes. And as a result, you have a sense of heightened awareness of what you've seen before. So again, Michelle, how on earth does this relate to Revelation? Let's see. Well, as I said, and as Christopher made very clear, Rome is our predominant idea with the beast and with the whore of Babylon. But is it as simple as that? As I said, the text is imbued with all these other experiences, and none of them work perfectly. What if we read it as all of them? What if we experience Proverbs 1-9 and the tension of the good woman and the bad woman? Jeremiah's destruction of Babylon. It's a very convincing reading by Priya Prejan on this. Isaiah 23 and the destruction of Tyre. Read the text with just one of these and you'll be convinced that you've hit the right one. Read them together, it gets muddied. Ezekiel 23, as I said, with the destruction of Samaria. Ezekiel 23 with the destruction of Israel. And this is where I get dodgy. Jeremiah 4 with Jerusalem also resonates pretty strongly, as does Ezekiel 16 and Jerusalem. All of them together at once. A highly effective text where the audience are replaying past textual experience. Past textual experiences are awoken, both that have been put to the Jewish people themselves through the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of foreign nations, in a symbol which is held in tension, where you experience multiple pasts at the same time, which allows you to reflect on the horror of Babylon. How much do you partake in the destruction? How distant are you from it? Chanel T. Smith's done an excellent book on this, reading it with slave culture and her own background as a descendant from slaves. What happens when you see yourself partaking in the destruction as well as other, self and other held together? A text where the past is brought to life. And rather than controlling the past text, as we tend to do with biblical scholars, as you can tell, this is my guild, what if we open it up and we allow it to speak and we feel these emotions and we become affected by seeing the past again? So Revelation 17, the past plus, reviewing all the past texts, however uncomfortable it may be, awakens past encounters, and we have to face up to them. Okay, now I have got enough time. I'm going to whiz you through one more example. Revelation 18, far from the past. Revelation 18, obviously, Michelle's good comment for the day, follows Revelation 17. But it's a change. The whore very much moves into a city. It says at the end of the chapter, the woman you saw is the city. And it very much moves into a city. We move from a very heady, emotive text into a text which signals literary artifice. Here, Revelation is at its most like other Hebrew Bible texts. It's incredibly similar. Ideas that might be argued for it are based on Ezekiel 26 to 28, or mainly reliant on Jeremiah's oracles against Babylon. It is very difficult to see this text as anything else. It involves laments over the city, woe, woe, Babylon, the city, the great, who has fallen. D.H. Lawrence said, in actual fact, because it's so similar, the best poetry is all the time lifted from Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Isaiah. It is not original. This claim unsettles biblical scholars because we don't want the past to be reused without a sense of originality, right? That would be worrying. That would go against all of our notions of post-romantic worth. So, John is more original than some of his interpreters would allow him to be, says Mons. Something new and creative, says Boxall. A fresh prophecy, a highly effective description of his own, says Borkham. A new original formulation which organises a new coherence, says Pregent. You can see the idea. It looks really, really similar, but it's not. How do we read this? You can see an anxiety with the reuse of the past appearing here. Well, just going to show you really quickly that this text really is very, 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 very like the past. Similar phases, phrases, faces, and features. It is a sense of you've seen it all before. And as nobody wants Greek after lunch, and I keep pressing this so I can see the time. Just to say, fallen, fallen Babylon the Great, that's the opening line. Remarkably like Isaiah 21-9, some people say it's a direct quotation, slightly different change of tense. Jeremiah 51:8, got two falls there, but again, slightly tiny, tiny difference with no the great. So you can't say it's exactly the same. Come out of her, my people, in verse 4 is declared. This is very like Jeremiah 51:45 and calls to come out of Babylon, also like Jeremiah 58, also like 51:6, also like Isaiah 48:20, also like Isaiah 52:11. You get the idea. It's not just like one text. You hear a decree and it resonates with lots of different experiences. Familiar phases. Well, there's a throwing of stones that happens in Revelation 18. A mighty angel takes it up, throws it down. This is very like Jeremiah 51, but with some changes because it's a millstone and it's cast into the sea rather than into the Euphrates, which happens. Or there's a declare. I've put, yes, I am invincible, but there's a hubris declaration. which also is a very common trope. It looks like Isaiah 47, but Aune finds 6 examples in the Hebrew Bible of these hubris soliloquies, and it's also remarkably like Ezekiel 28. Getting the idea? It's not just one, it's many. It's very, very like. Faces, same idea. City destroyed, unclean animal comes in. This is like Babylon, everybody says. Yeah, it is like Babylon. That's very true. But it's also like Nineveh, Jerusalem, and Edom. Boom, boom, boom. It's a trope. Familiar features. There's a trade list that happens in 12 to 13, a bombarding polyasyndeton where you have and all these different goods from gold to slaves. This is very like Ezekiel 27, which has a long trade list. However, in that, it's much longer. It has origins, and there are similarities. 15 or 18 of the 29 items are the same. Just enough to split scholars over it's radically different or radically the same, because it's like 55%. So it's a little bit different, but 2 things that particularly stand out is the movement of human souls to the end of the list, and a rare word for chariots, rada, which has a Latinate root, which was your 4-wheeled chariot, which you went to your country estate on if you were a landed Roman gentry. Fact for the afternoon. So what do we see? This is very, 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 very palpably past at all levels. It is remarkably similar. This is not a text that's like one experience, getting the idea, many experiences coming together. It's very difficult to argue that this is new, original, completely different. So a quick quiz through Far From Heaven. Todd Haynes was an art house director who moved into the mainstream with Far From Heaven in 2002, 4 Oscar nominations. It is a film which is palpably past. It's about a lady called Kathy who lives in Hartford, Connecticut, who has a seemingly idyllic life married to a man called Frank. Unfortunately, Frank suffers from problems, which euphemistically means he's gay. And the problems come back. Eventually their marriage crumbles. He moves in with his younger lover, and she's left on her own. And she turns to her gardener, her black gardener, Raymond, for solace. It's an interracial friendship, which in 1950s Hartford, Connecticut, where this film is set, cannot hold. Eventually Raymond has to leave and move to Baltimore, and Kathy is left alone with her children. It's a very, very poignant film. It is completely talking in the language of the past in the 1950s. The skirts, the clothes, he even used lighting gels to get a similar feeling of these 1950s films. Specifically 50s films directed by Douglas Sirk, arts house lover. He specialised in mirrors, these cold to dark lighting tones, films like Imitation of the Past, Written on the Wind. All That Heaven Allows is a film which is incredibly similar to Far From Heaven. You can see it in the title. It's about a woman called Carrie who falls for her younger gardener, Ron. Her family disapproves. She's a widower, and she's close to giving up Ron. At the end, he has an accident, and they kind of have a bittersweet reuniting. These 2 films are incredibly similar. Here on the left is Carrie and Ron. You can see that the clothing echoes. Carrie gets given a piece of foliage, so does Kathy, but slightly different. You could describe it as palpably similar. Here are the 2 opening credits. You can see towers. There's these eggshell blue cars that drive around, and it's always autumnal. It's really, really, really playing with your past ideas. The film's credits and opening sequence feel almost traced, as if superimposing it frame for frame onto All That Heaven Allows, says Willis. It's a steady downpour of references, but don't think that it's just playing with one text. There are moments from, this is playing with Magnificent Obsession, and also there's a dancing scene which plays with Rainer Weiner Fassbinder's Ali Fear Eats the Soul, which itself is playing with Douglas Sirk, set with a Moroccan immigrant and a German woman in the 70s. But it's never exactly the same. In All That Heaven Allows, the friend, Sarah, gets out of the car at the beginning, whereas it's our protagonist, Kathy, who comes out at the top. And Kathy, actually you can see on the far side, is wearing the clothes that Sarah wears. It's really subtly playing with what you've seen before and just messing it up a tiny, tiny bit. Carrie, her husband makes TVs, so that's why they have a telly, whereas in the other film, it's given to her as a point of solace. Anyway, how do we react to a highly artistic recreation of past textual encounters, which never ceases to remind us of these experiences, while never actually presenting us with the same? So here are some of the things that we might want to think about in relation to a film like this. Small gestures scream. When you're feeling something so similar, they do not have to be very different for you to realize that similar is not the same as the same. You can change things very subtly. Similarity heightens this awareness, therefore, that it is not the same. If you wear the same thing every day and then one day you change the color of your shoes, somebody will notice them. And what this brings into focus is a sense of lacking, less than, and distance. What you come to realize watching the film, which is part of the difficulty of watching it, is actually that this is a film set in the past. It's set in a past that's gone. Rock Hudson is dead. Jane Wyman is dead. These clothes are moth-ridden. The 1950s the film is representing is rotting in the streets of Detroit. And also, you realize the problems within these films. A sense that a film about interracial love could never be made in the 1950s. That even to mention Frank's problems is an issue of 2002, not of the 1950s. And it brings in a sense of loss of what has gone, but at the same time a sense of distance, of realizing that things aren't the same, and perhaps we need to try and come to terms with that, this sense of loss, that the past is just that, it's past, and never recoverable nor inhabitable. Julianne Moore is wonderful, but she's not Jane Wyman. We can't make Lara Turner come back. They are gone. And in that sense, it's a Jameson way of doing historicity, where we wrestle with this messed up timeline, where we try and put ourselves in the line of what we've inherited and where we are now. So, back to Revelation. 2 ways I would suggest of rereading Revelation 18 to help us remove our fear of the past. We redraw difference and we embrace lacking and loss. In Revelation 18 there is a creeping difference and an aching distance from what has happened before. This text is not the same. You can't explain it through pinpointing all the differences. You have to feel them together to feel this difference. It's in the unsettling realm of similar. But there are issues here. Babylon is back, and the past texts say she isn't going to come back. And you're hearing a text that says she's back. How is this possible? We shouldn't be experiencing this again as an audience. The prophets have told us she will fall. She has fallen. Why is she back? This code name for Rome. This sense of lacking, of what can't be got again, is in all the work on Far From Heaven. Politics of Disappointment, Double-Edged Longing, Orange and Blue, Desire and Loss, these are the titles of publications. Experiencing this pastness intensifies the realization that the situation is not the same. This is what I argue Revelation 18 is doing by being so similar. It is making the audience come to terms with the fact that they are not the people of the past. This is not so God did in the past, so he will do again. But how do we wrestle with our changed situation? With a new empire, with Rome. Rome is not Babylon. It is not Assyria. The persecutions that they are facing are not the same. The small congregations who are Jesus believers are not the same as the predecessors who have received the prophecies. And there is a sense of wrestling with that difficulty. And this is the fear with the past. We can't re-inhabit it, but we also can't unsee what we've seen, and it stays with us. The past brings the present into view. And those pesky chariots sit there to remind us that this is Rome. This is not Babylon. And the human soul's moving to the end, a tiny, tiny subtle shift, but something to show that perhaps the ideology needs to be shifted as well in these new locations of drawing attention to these problems. We could say it's contaminated by the present. And so when they're called, come out of her, my people, leave the empire, they can't. This is not an empire that you pop up and leave out of the city walls. This is different. How do you deal with that? The world has changed. So, Malevich is cracking. The past coming through. The black year zero that seems to say we can start again. Revelation that seems to say we're going to show you the future. Perhaps the future is constructed from the terror that is the past that we cannot escape. And it is the fact that we need to come to terms with that Revelation is playing with, just like Malevich painted over something, which is now coming back and showing that perhaps he was dealing with other artworks and wasn't quite as original as people have said he is. And let's face it, John of Patmos, as we see with Michael's fantastic New Jerusalem, was himself obsessed with cubes and with blank squares that you could project things onto. But nobody's doing something that comes from nothing. And the New Jerusalem is absorbing the past. It seems like Babylon. It seems like Rome. The past casts the longest shadows, and it's not the fear of the future, but it's these shadows for scholars and texts alike that I would argue we need to wrestle with. Thank you.
Wonderful, Michelle. Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure we don't have any comments after that talk. No? No, I'm just kidding. Yes.
No, it was fascinating. I'm coming at this from my perspective as an art critic dealing with contemporary art today, and what strikes me is that not only is the Book of Revelation a pastiche of all of these previous texts, but it's also now for us, and the reason that why we keep talking about it is that it's a pastiche of all the meanings that have been laid on it ever since. And particularly in terms of contemporary art, contemporary culture, these, in a way, we've sort of reconstructed the tropes from the Book of Revelation to speak to our own time. Just to use one example, the horsemen of the apocalypse, which seems ever upon us. So there's the pastness of the Book of Revelation, but there's also the presentness in that it keeps being recreated, and that. In the same way that it was recreated anew for John, now we're recreating it for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. But to recreate anew doesn't lose contact with the past, and so it brings that inheritance with it. And I think also part of what I do with this is I'm critiquing my discipline of biblical scholarship, and particularly the historical critical sense of biblical scholarship, is this belief we're getting back to the original meaning. We can get back to the history. And part of what I want to show is that the past of scholarship and the past of these texts that we're absorbing, like the fear that it could be Jerusalem, is actually skewing the supposed objectivity anyway, because we can't unsee our own pasts as scholars. And so that also is becoming part of the interpretation, and it's becoming embodied and codified in the commentaries as objective truth. But it itself is absorbing, as you said, all of those things.
Yeah, it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I want to kind of understand, and perhaps you can help me, how does the Book of Revelations become an obsession for evangelical Christians to seek the end of the world? We like to call that the apocalypse. Am I correct in calling that the apocalypse? The end of the world, and not see through the work as a metaphor for the self and the end of the civil unrest and the death and all of the destruction of the self. It just seems to me that there's a schism there that's not reconcilable to me, but perhaps you know.
It's interesting. I mean, it's not like we can say that evangelical Christians are the first people to read it that way. So the Montanists in the 200s took up off a mountain and were like, hey, it's going to come down from heaven. And very early on we find Daniel and Revelation being blended together. And it says something about the human condition and our anxieties, that a text which seems to be so confusing, it makes us want to understand it. It's a bizarre place to go to, right? Like, I'd rather go to a telephone directory because it seems to do things that make sense, whereas every time I read Revelation, it seems to mean something different to me. Yeah, exactly, WTF. So it's odd, but it says something about our controlling need for a text, I think, as humanity, that it can give us that, a sense of an anthrocentric reading, that we could somehow have access to that, a primacy of certain groups of understanding it, but also our anxiety, that we turn to something that we can project our own anxieties onto, and the text is springy enough to take that. My future and your future, your idea of the end and mine, who's in and who's out is not the same. And that's one of the great ones with this, is you think you read Revelation better, who's outside? That's a way to make a room love each other.
It's great preaching. I love to watch preachers.
It certainly, it has, everybody likes to have their place in it. And I can't talk because, hey, it's my career. I'm just as guilty, right? I just say it in a different way. I'm trying to control it with a narrative today.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about Babylon. So you were saying, I think powerfully, that experiencing multiple antecedents of Babylon can help us to engage with this issue of culpability. But I wonder, can you say a little bit more about, are you talking about culpability in the sense of when we might be acting like Babylon, or culpability in the sense of that we are all responsible for her downfall, and sort of how that speaks to recent feminist scholarship and some modern representation, visual representations of Babylon, where she's portrayed much more as a victim than as a perpetrator.
And I think that is obviously undoing my own past and ideologies. I am a feminist critical scholar, and you probably wouldn't realise it if you're reading my book. But this sense of self and other, Tina Pippin's work, Lynn Huber's work, very much holding that intention. And so when I was looking at these past texts and the fear of Jerusalem, I couldn't get away from the fact that when you read it, it does resonate with Jerusalem. And so the point I was using there is, if we use the different incarnations of cities that it could mean, if you decode her and say she's a city, you can get caught up in the fact that she's not enemy cities, because it's often like she's the ultimate enemy city, so she must be Babylon, or she must be Nineveh, she can't be Jerusalem. But actually she could be your own city that has recently been destroyed, because if you date Revelation post the destruction of the temple in 70, which I do, I think it's dealing with an anxiety of the loss of the temple. And so how are you dealing with seeing your own destruction portrayed? Because that's happened to you, but also wanting your enemies' downfall at the same time. There is an anxiety there. Now, whether you say, hey, done it to us, back to you, that's one option. But also these feminist readings which allow us to see ourselves in it, to be confused with who is the whore? Am I the whore? I'm part of a capitalist system. That's pretty hoary. Am I responsible? It's a way that allows us to re-inhabit that image and to be affected by it. And it's often out of our own anxiety that we scream at other people the most. So I think having this dual perspective of historical cities can help us see that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I suppose it might be a way of avoiding the Tina Pippin problem of, casting Revelation out of the canon altogether. If you do read the image against these sort of multiple antecedents, then it becomes more complex, but more, complex, but there's a way forward. There becomes a way forward as well.
And I really recommend Chanel T. Smith's book, where she does read as part of the dominating culture, who's made it into the white academy as the granddaughter of slaves. The tension that she feels within that really opens up and moves. Tina's work's brilliant, and now we're moving into this next realm of womanist readings, and it's a really powerful womanist reading with that, so I really recommend that. And Lynn Huber does a great queer reading of it in relation to David LaChapelle's Madonna, and a queer desire for Madonna whilst also being female and feeling her as the whore of Babylon, as her destruction is problematic. So the male gaze of desire, but self as the female. So I really recommend that one as well.
Anybody else? Yeah, Elena?
to me, has its own reality outside of, you know, imposition, outside of the writer, outside of the readers, outside of, and the original, not the original, but the Old Testament text, the Hebrew Bible texts, have their own reality as texts and beyond texts, as visions and beyond visions. So how do you sort of reconcile that? I mean, if you look at, because I agree with what you're saying on a historical level, on a sort of a materialist level, but I also think that it has its own reality outside of that. And I guess if to go back to Walter Benjamin, sort of the messianic it of course is not political for Walter Benjamin. It is political, but it's not political. It operates outside of the political and outside of the historical.
Although Revelation's notion of the messianic, and that if you think of the Christophany, where he's got bare feet, that's indicating he's a bit like a god. The emperors had bare feet in their statues, so you could watch their divine gate to see. Benjamin is doing something with the messianic, but he's also a product of his own environment as well. So you can read with that back onto it, but Revelation, to remove it from a political reading and to remove it, I don't want to use the word ontology because it makes me feel a bit sick every time I say it, but I was doing it very much from a reader response, because for me, the book of Revelation would have been read, I would argue, out loud in congregations. So 7 letters or multiple churches, people hearing themselves in it, and multiple perspectives. And so I didn't want to necessarily focus on textual reality, but the point of engagement of self, of collective engagement, and that sense of it is, if you're looking at it historically, you need to hold it in tension with its political idea. And I suppose it depends whether I believe that it's worth anything outside of its own sphere of understanding. And we might, we might differ there on it inscribes its own reality, but whether I would necessarily say that I would very much say we always need to it's nothing unless you lift the lid on it and look in the box, from me. Okay, does that make sense? So,
right, I suppose I'm just
pulling,
trying to get to a different box. I'm going more towards the metaphysic of it rather than the purely human.
I'm going to duck out of metaphysical, I'm afraid. I will stick with human, because for me, I think the interesting stuff with Revelation happens when we get down and dirty with it. And actually, I think it has been reified enough, even by being in the canon, and the understanding and the inheritance that I have of a scholar of other reified texts where this is truth, where this does speak beyond our time now. I want to muddy, because I see people calling truth something that is of their own product, and I deal with a very dangerous text. Like, this is not just about gender politics. People have basically waged war. The missions to the Mexicans were built around architecture representing the New Jerusalem in America. That's problematic. So I want to get outside of the larger questions, because I think they have been dealt with a lot, and muddy it with people. I think it's a good conversation for us to have over a longer, more interesting, and I think they dialogue together really interestingly. I really enjoyed your paper.
Thank you, likewise.
I think we probably, let's put them together.
I agree.
Two sides of a coin, obverse, reverse. Yeah?
Okay, anyone, anything brief? Let's take a break. Wonderful, Michelle, thank you so much.